There are two distinct ways fighters sit down on a punch. Some drop their weight into the punch. Others drive upwards. Today, we're exploring what the science says about both approaches, and which option fighters like Ali, Triple G, and Lomachenko actually use. In my previous video on sitting down, I demonstrated one interpretation of this powerful mechanic. After reading through the comments, many of you shared that you were taught a different interpretation of this technique. As an exercise scientist and a martial artist, I was curious to test both versions objectively. So, I used the power cube to measure exactly what happens to your power output with each version of sitting down on your punch. Plus, I discovered a unique third version that generated the highest power of all. I also analysed how the world's top boxers implement these mechanics. First, I want to thank everyone who watched my previous video. Your comments inspired this follow-up exploration. Now, let's look at today's experiment. As with all my experiments, steps were taken to reduce the variables and isolate the core mechanic. In this case, the sitting mechanic. This is so we can directly observe how each interpretation affects the power generation in the rear straight punch. I maintained the same stance and distance from the target for all tests. I covered the power cube display during testing, so I couldn't see the numbers. This prevented any unconscious bias that may occur if I could see which technique was generating higher numbers. I adjusted the power cube height for each technique to ensure my arm would be parallel upon impact. Slightly lower for the dropping technique and higher for the rising technique. You can also see that I'm wearing a different glove than in the previous video, so you know this is an entirely new test. The testing sequence was structured as such to minimize fatigue. 10 punches using the dropping technique, 1 minute rest. 10 punches using the rising technique, 1 minute rest, repeated a second time. After testing these two interpretations, I then performed 2 sets of 10 punches using the third hybrid method, which I'll cover in a moment. Let's start by comparing the two main interpretations of sitting down that we discussed earlier. The dropping technique, where weight shifts downward into the punch, produced an average power output of 8,907 watts, with a peak of 11,199. The kinetic energy transfer measured at 96.4 joules, on average with a peak of 118. This technique uses what I call gravity assist. It's a great option for power generation without requiring excessive training. However, I also believe that it has a ceiling. There is only so much power you can generate with gravity's help. The only variable you can change is how much mass you have. Now, the rising technique generated about 3.3% more power and around 7% more kinetic energy on average than the dropping method. However, its peak power actually measured 6.2% lower at 10,503 watts. But interestingly, it still had a higher peak kinetic energy at 126 joules, 6.7% higher. I believe the reason for this difference relates to that ceiling that I mentioned. The driving version can generate more kinetic energy due to its use of leg power, rather than gravity. Leg drive can be trained, and leg muscles can be strengthened. The limit is only in the athlete. The downside is the time and training it takes to develop this power, while gravity works instantly for anyone. Over a 40-punch comparison, 3 to 7% difference isn't a huge amount. So, which version do you think the pros actually use? Let's watch some clips and find out. First up is Ali. As we can see, uses a driving motion, extending that rear leg. There, extension for the rear straight punch. Second clip is Triple G. Again, we have this extension through the back leg, extending up to twist the hips through for the rear straight punch. Now third, we've got some shots here from Canelo, extending up through that back leg, but also extending the front leg at the same time, which is something interesting which I will have a look at in future. All right, next up we have Bivol. There, once again, we can see he's driving that back leg, extending up, driving up with it. But note, something interesting is he actually drops himself down first before extending up. And now here's another shot of Bivol. He's actually doing the dropping motion in this one here, but he's using it for a body shot, for a low target. Drops his weight down. All right, Pacquiao's next. Again, similar to Bivol, what we're seeing here is he drops himself down and springs out, but still uses that driving upwards motion for his shot there. Down and up. This is something interesting to note. 2 of them have done that so far. We've also got Lomachenko. He does the same thing. He's dropping down and then extending up. This one's a hook rather than a rear straight punch, but still we have that same drop coming down and then he's extending up using the driving version for that punch. And lastly, I have a second clip from Lomachenko here where he is using that same weight drop for his body shot jab down low there, dropping motion. But seeing that these elite boxers are using a dropping and driving motion, you can see it here, we can see it here with Pacquiao, and we can see it here, this drop drive. I thought I'd give it a test and I'll see what the difference was between dropping, driving, and then combining the two together, getting a hybrid dip then drive motion. The results were remarkable. While the dropping technique averaged 8,907 watts, and the rising technique 9,200 watts, this hybrid dip then drive approach generated an average of 11,098 watts. That's nearly 25% higher than the dropping technique, and 21% more than the rising approach. The peak numbers are even more impressive. The hybrid technique hit a maximum of 13,689 watts, eclipsing both traditional methods by a significant margin. Looking at kinetic energy transfer, the hybrid approach generated 122.3 joules on average, and it peaked at 152, substantially exceeding both of the other techniques. From a biomechanical perspective, this dramatic improvement makes perfect sense. The hybrid version leverages what is called the stretch shortening cycle. When you briefly dip down, you're pre-stretching the quadriceps and other leg muscles, creating elastic energy and activating stretch receptors called muscle spindles. This brief stretch, followed immediately by contraction, creates significantly more force than either the pure rising motion or the dropping motion alone. We see this principle in virtually every explosive athletic movement: jumping, throwing, sprinting. This explains why most elite boxers instinctively incorporate this small dip before their most powerful explosive punches. They've discovered through years of training what the biomechanical data confirms. By consciously incorporating this dip drive movement into your punches, you can potentially increase your power output. But remember, this version needs to be trained. Both the leg drive and the stretch shortening cycle benefit from explosive plyometric training. So when should you use each of these techniques in your own training? The dropping technique is most effective for lower targets, body shots, leg kicks, or any strike where you're aiming downwards. The natural alignment with gravity helps direct force naturally to lower targets. The rising drive technique works well for head-level targets, especially when you need to maintain height or are throwing quick combinations. And the hybrid dip drive should be your go-to for maximum power, when you have the space and the time to execute it properly. This method generated significantly more force in testing and is what we see elite boxers using for their most devastating punches. By understanding these mechanical differences, you can make better tactical choices based on your target and the situation. The science has given us clear insights into what elite boxers like Ali, Triple G and Lomachenko have been doing instinctively for years. The data not only confirms their approach, but helps us to understand exactly why it works. What's most fascinating is how the mechanics of the hybrid dip drive method create such a significant power advantage, nearly 25% more than the dropping technique. The stretch shortening cycle is a fundamental principle that applies across virtually every explosive athletic movement. By applying these scientific insights to your training and choosing the right technique for each situation, you'll access striking power you didn't know you had, all through a deeper understanding of what it really means to sit down on your punch. This is just one example of how understanding biomechanics can dramatically improve your martial arts performance. The Power Cube reveals hidden insights that traditional training often misses. Let me know in the comments which martial arts techniques or concepts you would like to see tested. I read them all and I use them to plan for future videos. If this video helped you understand the science behind your martial arts, give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss my next technique breakdown. And be sure to share this video with your fellow martial artists.